So it is the 2nd of June and my build is somewhat behind, but we have had progress on multiple fronts because we now have a spray booth, which I made last week, and I was testing it out at the weekend. Therefore it appears to be explosion proof and I haven't exploded yet. Just sprayed some sealer on these testers. What's that? A bit of Croatian curly and offcut from the build. Smoke machine to test how well it removes fumes. Came with disco lights. We also have a completed neck, apart from fine sanding. So yeah, you better get yourself a beer because there's quite a lot to cover on this one. So this neck blank is Eastern European walnut from Bosnia. When it came to me about 18 months ago, it was neither particularly dry nor quarter sawn. In fact, it measured at about 15% on my moisture meter. So I decided to rough out the profile of the neck and left it to dry. And when I came to use it for this project, it was registering at about 7.5%, so I was quite confident that it was dry enough to use. It had, however, developed a slight back bow here and also a bit of a twist. So I don't know how well you can see on the camera, but I decided to resaw off a good 30mm of one side. So the grain here is fairly uniform, and then it starts to sweep over around here as it starts to reach the centre of the tree. I'm assuming the centre of the tree was probably somewhere around here. So I cut off the most unstable wood, and in doing so I cut off all of the twist as well. And I also managed to keep most of the curl that was in the wood, which otherwise would have been wasted. So hopefully I've got the most stable wood I could get out of that blank and also the most attractive. So with the twist gone, I still had to remove this hump here to get this nice and flat, so I just used my number 5, skimmed across the top, mostly in the middle, and that gave me a nice flat surface to work from. And then I used the number 5 again and put in a 13-degree angle into the headstock, making sure that that was perfectly square with the front, because I didn't have any other square sides because I'd roughed out one side on the bandsaw. The other side was just rough sawn from the sawmill that it came from. It clearly been cut with a table saw. So once those two were in, I made a new centre line using the edge that was cut with the table saw, because that was a fairly true line, and then I just used the marking gauge and put a centre line in. So once I had a centre line and I knew where my nut was going, I routed my truss rod channel using my little Makita trim router and its fence. So then I just fettled up at this end with a chisel just so I could get my truss rod nut in there, and then I left it for another couple of days to see if there was any more movement, and there wasn't, so I could crack on. So once I was happy that the neck was still stable, I made a couple of ears out of the offcut. I just planed all of the surfaces to get nice glue joints, glued those on using a couple of grains of salt and some tight bond, clamped those up one at a time, and then I roughed out the shape of the neck on the bandsaw. Then once the shape of the neck was roughed out, I used my Makita trim router in my crude little router table along with the template, and just used the bearing bit to route the taper of the neck. My little router's only 1/4 of an inch, and the longest bit I've got for that I think is about 30mm, so I just had to plane the excess off that the router bit wouldn't reach with a little block plane. So I ran my fretboard blank through the drum sander. I got that down to a hair over 5mm. I like to keep my fretboards at about 5mm at the thickest point in the centre. My rationale for that being that the fretboard is nearly always a much harder piece of wood than the wood that's used for the neck. And if I'm taking about 1mm off of here, when I'm carving my neck to final dimensions, I've got about an extra mil behind the truss rod nut here, which should make for a stronger neck, and I'm less likely to have a visit from Mr. Truss Rod while I'm carving it. And then I marked out all the dimensions on the fretboard blank and cut it to length. So I glued the fretboard on using some Typeboard Original, Nature's glue spreader and a few grains of salt. If you haven't used the salt trick, I highly recommend giving it a go because it removes the need to faff around with locator pins, and I've done 4 fretboard glue ups now and I haven't had a fretboard slip once, so I highly recommend that. I just used a couple of quick clamps to hold the fretboard in place, and then I came back with G-clamps and cauls to get the fretboard glued down properly. Once the fretboard had dried overnight, I then roughed the excess off with a bandsaw and then just came back with a little trim router table and got it nice and flush with a neck taper. So I still had some excess on the tenon. I never tend to route the end grain of the heel anymore. Well, you can see why. There's a bit of runoff in that very corner, and I wasn't even trying to route the end grain, but it just caught that edge and sent it flying across the workshop, which is handy that everything was still oversized. So I cut it very close to length with a tenon saw, and then I just used the bobbin sander to get that final shape right. So once the shape of the neck was all done and the fretboard was on, I used my miniature shooting board and I just planed a bit of an angle into my headstock veneer, which I sanded down to about 1.5mm thick, and then I butted that up to the nut, which I just had dry fitted in place to make sure my angle was right, and then I glued the veneer on, just again using a bit of Typebond and the salt trick. Once the veneer had dried overnight, I cut the excess off so I could use that piece later on for a truss rod cover, and then I drilled the access for the truss rod. This wood is lovely in colour, but it is a bit on the splitty side, and even with a mega sharp Famag bit it still gave me a little bit of tear out, but that came off quite nicely with a razor blade. And I marked out the dimensions for the heel, so I wanted to make sure it was perfectly square and the right height. This would have been a lot easier to do before I glued the fretboard on, however I forgot. So now I used the number 5 again and got the heel nice and square. So I had to make some binding, and I used the offcuts from when I resawed the top, and I didn't do an amazing job at resawing, so I only had about just over 1.5mm thick binding by the time it had been through the drum sander. So I routed a 1.5mm rebate all along the fretboard and then tested the binding, and it was a nice fit. The binding was just a hair over where it needed to be. And then once that was done, I got to work on radiusing the fretboard. I was in two minds about this one. I was either going to use some jumbo stainless steel fret wire, which I like a lot, or I was going to put in a compound radius, which I also like a lot. I wasn't going to do both because life's too short, and I decided to opt for a compound radius. You may have noticed that I've used a number 5 Stanley for most of the planing that I've done so far. That plane's fairly new to me. My dad gave that one to me, and I've used it for pretty much everything, and I liked it so much that I decided to get myself a number 6. So I planed in a compound radius on the number 6, which is the perfect size plane for planing a fretboard. And I was shooting for 9.5 to 12.5, and I think I ended up with about 9.5 to a hair under 13, so that came out quite nicely. And then I just finalised the radius with some 120 on a sanding beam. Then once that was in, I put in a new centre line with a centre rule and then a straight line, and then I marked out my fret slots using the Crimson 4-in-1 fret slot rule, which today, out of all the tools from Crimson I've bought, that is by far my favourite tool. And I wish Ben would get on and do a baritone 4-in-1 scale, because I've been asked a few times to make baritone and baritone fan fret guitars. Yeah, not doing that just yet until I've got some decent marking tools, because I don't like measuring fret slots very much. So my method for cutting fret slots then is to start them off with the razor saw, and I like that because it just seems to cut through any wood, no matter how hard it is, like butter, down to maybe half to a mil deep before it starts to snag on the kerf of the cut. And that's when I then come back and switch over to a fret saw and I finish it off then. When I start off sawing my slots, I tend to do one little nick inwards, and that just prevents any of the wood from blowing out. And the other thing to be careful of is to just not put the saw in too an acute an angle at the edge of the slot, because you run the risk of putting the blade through the base of the binding channel, and yeah, there's no hiding that one unless you're going to paint the guitar. So once my slots were cut, I just used a scalpel and a straight edge to bring the binding down so it was just over the height of the fretboard, and I just used some tartan tape to hold those down, and I just use a tiny amount of Titebond, and I tend to apply it with a brush. I see loads of people running a bead along the fretboard, and that's completely unnecessary. It's such a low strength joint, it doesn't need tons of glue, and the more glue you use, the more cleaning up you have to do in your fret slots with a little slot cleaning saw, and that's not a particularly fun job to do. So yeah, I just brush on a really sparing amount of glue, and that means that I barely have to do any work at clearing out these slots. And once that was all dry, I just used a little block plane to trim it close to the radius of the board. I was going to finish it off once I'd finished all the inlay work, and I wanted to get the radius finalised. So I normally do a bit of a moustache on the top of my headstocks, but this time round I decided to do something a bit different, and I just roughed the shape of that out on the bandsaw and then tidied it up on the spindle sander. So then I got round to cutting out my inlays, and I actually started off just by cutting out my truss rod cover as a bit of practice, because I haven't done any inlay work in about a year, I think. And then I fitted that using the nut, getting the angle right with the nut, the same way that I did with a headstock veneer, and I got that screwed down. So I cut my logo out of a piece of abalone laminate, and this stuff is made out of tiny pieces glued together to make ultra fine sheets, and then they glue those sheets together to make a kind of a ply. So it's a bit more brittle than solid shell abalone. However, it's about half the price and is available in much bigger pieces, because abalone is quite a small shell. So it's a good alternative to solid shell for inlay materials. It retains the shine that you don't tend to get with abalone effect celluloid and that kind of stuff, so it's one up from that. So once the inlay was all cut out, I used a tiny little dollop of super glue, and I used that to place the logo, and then I scored around it with a scalpel blade. I like the super glue trick because it just holds it in place with just the tiniest amount, and then the inlay should just twist off afterwards. Then once that was cut out, I used a new toy that I got recently, which is a Stumac Dremel base, which I actually got with the rosette cutter for cutting rosettes on acoustic bills, but it also comes in very handy for inlay work. So I used that fairly gingerly, as I haven't used that before, and left myself with a bit of work to do with hand tools. So I just tidied all that up with some small modelling chisels, or 1, 2 and 3 mil chisels. So I glued the inlay down with a few dollops of black star bond, and then I filled any gaps with some ebony dust that I made, and then I went over it a couple of times with some more dust and then some extra fine super glue. And Starbond emailed me a few weeks ago and asked me if I'd be interested in them sending me some glue and reviewing it on one of my videos, and given that I was going to buy some anyway, I said yeah, why not. So far I've got to say I'm very impressed with it. By the time I'd sanded the inlay flush and filled any gaps, you really can't see that there's any gaps there, because it wasn't my best work. So very impressed. I'll be using that stuff again. So for my 12th fret inlay, I cut out a couple of runes, and the pieces I had weren't big enough to do the entire shape in one go, so I had to cut out some pieces separately and then stick them together with super glue. So when I routed out the channel for the inlay, I just took a couple of offcuts of binding and I stuck them onto either side, and that gave me a perfectly flat surface to run the base of the router on, and that meant that my inlay channel would be perfectly flat and not take on the radius of the fretboard, which is not ideal because if it's flat I get a much better glue joint. So the other option is to sand the inlay to the radius of the fretboard and then glue it down, but the veneer on the side trick is much easier. So the same process with the headstock inlay. I routed out the rough channel and then I finessed that with my small chisels, and then I glued my inlays down with the black star bond, and then I just used some more ebony dust to fill all the gaps, and then went over it again with some extra fine super glue, and then I left that overnight to dry. And before I file any excess off, I always tend to leave the inlays overnight because I want to make sure the glue is fully cured. If the glue isn't fully cured, then I run the risk of the dust from the abalone shell, when I file that down, getting in and sticking to the glue, and it just means that I end up with little speckles around the edge of the inlay as opposed to a perfectly black line if the cavity is not perfect, which in my case it often isn't. And once that inlay was in, I drilled a load of 4mm holes and then I glued a load of abalone dots down. So I filed off most of the excess, and then I just came back with a leveling beam and tidied everything up. So onto the fretwork. I cut all my frets to just over length. I tend to cut the frets quite short, and I start at the 24th fret down. That way if I do cut a fret too short, I can use it for the next one down. And I just used some end cutters to cut those, and I got two new tools for this fret job. One was a pair of fret tang nippers. I've been wanting a pair of these for absolutely ages, and they were absolutely bliss to use because there is no filing of the underside of the fret required, and I think that must have probably shaven at least 45 minutes off of a fret job. And the other tool I used was the Hosco fret setter, which I got from Crimson Tools, and I really like this because it means the hammer doesn't have to run the risk of hitting the fretboard at all, and this is so much more precise, so you don't actually have to hit the fret anywhere near as hard to get it nicely seated. So I highly recommend those two. And when I'm tapping these frets in, I just used a tiny little bead of extra fine super glue in the slot, and that's just to fill the slot. Tap the fret in, and then I would then trim the excess off of the fret with the end cutters. The reason I tend to cut the ends of the frets as I go is twofold. A, if I run the risk of lifting the fret slightly, I want to do that when I've just tapped the fret in so the glue hasn't set and I can get that fully seated. And the other thing is, on a 24 fret guitar, these frets are so close you can't always get end cutters all the way in flush, and it just makes it easier to cut them at this point. And then I just used a leveling file to get the frets nice and flush with the fretboard, and then I came back at a bit of an angle to give them their rough bevel. So now that the frets were in, the only thing left to do on this neck was to get the thing carved. So I started off by thicknessing the back of the headstock, and to prevent the fretboard from fouling on my block marked square, I just stuck another veneer on with some masking tape and super glue, and that just allowed the top of the fretboard to ride against the fence, and I just gradually crept up on it, and that gave me the thickness that I wanted and the back of the volute. And then I carved the heel, just drawing around something round, and then I roughed in the shape using a 5-sweep gouge and a mallet, and then I came back with an Iwasaki file and just got that shape a bit closer to where I wanted it to be. Now I put a rough shape in for the volute using the Iwasaki files, and then after that I carved the shaft of the neck using the faceted method, So I think I do my facets slightly differently to a lot of people. I tend to follow the centre line as opposed to follow the taper of the neck. And what that means is that the neck is quite round at this end, but it becomes slightly more V-shaped at the back here, as opposed to becoming a larger round shape. So I guess a standard neck would be a cone shape, and this is a cone to more of a V, which is more of a compound neck shape. So once I'd carved in my facets using a Shinto rasp, I then rounded them all over using a microplane, which is one of my favourite neck carving tools. And then once those were rounded over, sanding the whole thing down to 80 grit. So the neck is shaped now. I've still got some more sanding to do, especially around this volute, a little bit around here and the heel, but it's pretty much there. So in the next episode we shall be doing all the routs for the body and getting the neck stuck on and getting it fine sanded and grain filled, because I really do need to chop now. See you next time.